All right, you know what? First of all, I want to say that it's good to talk to a fellow Marine, a fellow warrior, so I don't have to listen to civilians tell me how war is stupid, war is bad. At least there's some kind of concept of reality and not just living in faraway, distant zero land, which doesn't really make any sense. So that's always good. Let's just get right into it. Usually I like to, get some rapport and talk about the things that we actually agree on. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Why bother? I mean, it's late. It's 2:30 in the morning. There's some a-hole on the other page telling me that I'm a Canadian, calling me a troll, even though he refused to address any of my issues. But, one of the things about the Ron Paul position is that due to the 53 coup in Iran, this is what started the Islamic Revolution, which overthrew the Shah, which eventually caused us all the problems in the Middle East. Now, the question you really have to ask yourself is that how deep does our history go into the Middle East? If you read a book called Power, Faith, and Fantasy, and it's in the other YouTube video that I have, it talks about how one of the reasons why we came together as a nation was the founding fathers, if you read the Federalist Papers, realized that they needed a navy because they no longer fell under the protection of the British Crown. So this meant that they kept being attacked by pirates, the Barbary pirates, which were Arabs actually, which were Muslim Arabs. And they figured out that 13 separate colonies couldn't have a navy, so they decided that they needed some kind of federal, some kind of national, and Thomas Woods could get specific about federal or national or togetherness, even though there were still 13 separate colonies, which later led to the Civil War because they couldn't decide on whether it was federal or national or together, but they had to come together in some way to actually create a navy. So this means we were involved in the Middle East since the founding of the country. And not only were we involved in the Middle East, it's one of the reasons why we came together as a country was so that we could fight in the Middle East. So this whole non-intervention...
We weren't fighting over there. We were fighting in our waters, right? So that's defensive.
Wasn't necessarily. I mean, it was defensive. Now, that's a different argument whether interventionism. But as far as his argument as to 53, I don't know why his memory only goes back to 53. I mean, we've been involved in the Middle East since the founding of the country. Now, of course, it was a defensive war, and you could argue that the war in Iraq was much like an Israeli war, which is proactive. But still, our history in the Middle East goes back to, there's a guy named John Ledyard. And if you look him up, he was a great explorer of the Middle East. If you look at Mark Twain went to the Middle East. You look up his book. He actually was very dispirited with what he saw in the Middle East. He said it was disgusting and vile and awful. But we've been involved in the Middle East since way before 53, so I never understand why his memory doesn't go past 53. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's such a short sense of history. 53 is not that long ago in historical sense and term. I mean, if that's what he's basing his blowback theory on, is that because we overthrew somebody in 53, we've been involved with our missionaries and everything since...
Well, he's talking about us being involved with a government from, one of their countries. But if we're talking about being involved with people, then yeah, we can talk about pirates and, some crazy stuff. But he's talking about governments, like actual governments.
Do you actually think that most Ron Paul supporters even know that we went to war with the Barbary pirates, or do you think that their sense of history starts in 53?
But I mean, we're talking about outlaws compared to actual governments.
All right. And the other question is should we not have overthrown their Democrat leader, and I'm putting that in quotes, which was actually, as far as I can remember, was a communist-backed dictator, and the election was been much like the Hamas election or the Chavez election. I mean, why wouldn't we instill somebody that's in our interest? If we're going to be American firsters and claim that we want to do things in our interest, why wouldn't we overthrow somebody in our interest? And the fact that he was overthrown wasn't necessarily because we installed him. They weren't upset that we installed him. The problem was that we didn't back him. If you read Jean Kirkpatrick's Dictatorships and Double Standards, she talks about the fact, because, there's a big problem, like with the overthrow of Mubarak in Egypt. Mubarak was an American ally for 30 years, and it kind of goes to the American problem of how can we morally back an authoritarian regime, and then when they rise up democratically against him, what do we say to these people? We say, oh, I'm sorry, we were backing the person who was holding you in tyranny and slavery. Well, she brings up the important point is that, one, there's a difference between a tyranny and an authoritarian regime. A tyranny, much like in Iran, is where the government ceases to involve itself in every essence of your life.
If I could
Sure.
jump in real quick, whether or not we should back, or overthrow someone who is backed up by the commies, that's a really good question. I don't know if I can answer that, but as far as defeating communism, I mean, we just had to sit by and watch them defeat themselves.
I mean,
because
that's nice to say in hindsight, don't you think? I mean, I think there were a lot of Reagan's efforts when he basically told them, if you go into Poland, I will bring World War III, as opposed to Obama, who couldn't say word one for the Green Movement in Iran. He didn't say anything. Where that Reagan would have armed them like he armed the Contras if there was that kind of movement going on in Iran. His efforts in Afghanistan. His staunch policy. At one point, they said, we will give you complete peace if you just let us have your Star Wars project, and he walked out. And it's pretty ballsy. I mean, I think that a lot of his actions actually may have caused. I mean, in hindsight, you could say that it was a communist regime. There's no way a communist regime can survive because it's not based on economic sound principles. But I mean, look at China. I mean, China is not going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, I think probably eventually it'll collapse. But isn't that a bit hindsight to say that they would have collapsed anyway due to economic pressure?
Yeah, I mean, it is, but as far as your statement earlier about who should we back and who should we overthrow in different countries, that's if you ask me, I don't have the answer to that. I mean, but China is a good point, and honestly, I'm learning Chinese right now. I just got my associates.
How old are you?
I'm 24.
You're 24 and you're learning Chinese.
Yeah.
You're going places.
Yeah, I hope so. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, because...
But yeah, I mean, like, I think China is definitely a force to be reckoned with, But
do you plan on working in China?
Wake up, and hopefully, because the money that their government has been making off of making everything pretty much in the world and trading with it, all that money that they've made, they've just armed themselves to the teeth with all that money, and it's really scary.
Well, other than arming themselves with the teeth, they're using almost half their military budget. I think it could be almost their whole military budget to just to spy on their own people. There's a huge amount of their budget that they use just to spy on their own people. I mean, you got to worry about the democratic principles of whether people really inertly want to be free, if that thing is eventually not just going to collapse. But they have a strong hand in there. But back to my original point about dictatorships and double standards, she says that, do you remember Musharraf in Pakistan, or if you remember Mubarak in Egypt, and you remember Somoza, and you remember the Shah? The reason why we backed these people was to keep the Islamic hordes, well, except for Somoza, that was a different problem, the communist hordes, I guess, at bay. The arguments that were made against Iraq were very true in some sense, even though I thought that Iraq had to go because he was a threat. But minus that threat, the elimination of an authoritarian or a dictatorship regime, the argument was that doesn't mean that democracy is going to magically spring up. And the replacement of dictatorship doesn't necessarily mean democracy. And the United States policy was for Iran that without the Shah there, the Islamic hordes, which was eventually the Ayatollah Khomeini, are going to take over. And that's exactly what happened. And that's exactly our problem with the supposed Arab Spring in Egypt, is that without Mubarak there, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a democrat movement. Even if there really is some genuine liberals there who want to liberalize their societies, it's going to be taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood, because that's the political organization that is the only thing that's actually a real organization over there. So the removal of these necessary authoritarian regimes who we back does not mean democracy, and it leads to us having enemies in those countries. So the removal of the Shah, and when Jimmy Carter flip-flopped and floundered and couldn't back the guy, and then, unfortunately, which is not really his fault, when the rescue operation, the helicopter crashed, not really his fault, but it just turned into a major disaster. And this is why we back these authoritarian regimes, is to keep these countries at bay, because there are bad elements within them, and the lack of them doesn't necessarily mean democracy, as far as to why we took over Iran in the first place.
So how would you say that the Muslims would take over if they didn't have those dictators?
If they didn't have those dictators, you would see what you're seeing now. You're seeing a military regime going on in Egypt. If you see the YouTube videos, you have the military there. The military, which is the only real power there now, they're in league with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the political powerful organization over there. And then they're the military organizations. They came together before they were throwing out Mubarak. There was a deal made between them. What would happen is that you had exactly with the Iranian Revolution of '79. You would have the Ayatollah Khomeinis and the clerics take over the country. That's exactly what would happen.
But after they're done taking over their country, then you think they would spread to try and overtake other countries?
I think they would have to. I think it's just because, especially the guys in Iran, you're dealing with a special breed of loon. Those guys, they really believe that, if they take over the planet, then, their Messiah is coming. You know, they're waiting for the 12th to come out. And I mean, they're 12ers, as Mr. Beck likes to call them, and I buy that. These guys are really, really dangerous. And again, with the problem is with, you know, when liberals bring up the whole fact about, you know, hey, how come we're the only ones that ever had nuclear weapons, and, you know, we're the only ones who ever dropped them. The difference between us and other countries, and like, let's say Iran having a nuclear weapon, is that we have a democratic elected civilian leadership, which means that we have a representative. So when he drops the bomb, it's really all of us saying drop the bomb. When you have just 5 people who have taken over a country, that means you have put the nukes in the hands of 5 people with no elections. That's a problem when it's only 5 nutcases with a bomb.
Honestly,
See, and dropping.
If you ask me, you know, if like you say the Brotherhood takes over and they start trying to take over other countries.
Yeah.
You know, like the Muslim. You say the Muslim horde will be, you know, trying to take over or spread.
Excuse my language. Yes.
Yeah. Oh no, it's cool. Excuse my